It started with something completely unrelated, declassified naval logistics documents from the late 1940s. I wasn't looking for a conspiracy. I was trying to understand the supply chain of Operation High Jump, the massive American military expedition. I was interested in cold weather logistics, but the more I read, the more the numbers stopped making sense. Rear Admiral Richard Byrd led nearly 4,700 men, 13 ships, and multiple aircraft to the edge of the world. The official purpose was straightforward: map the coastline, establish a research presence, and test military equipment in extreme cold. It was the largest Antarctic expedition in human history. The mission was planned to last 6 to 8 months. But then, after only 8 weeks, the entire fleet was abruptly recalled. The official explanation cited weather and resource constraints, but the logistics records tell a different story. Supplies were categorized as surplus, and the weather windows were actually opening, not closing. Byrd returned and gave a haunting interview in Chile. He spoke about the possibility of a threat coming from the polar regions. He spoke about objects that could fly from pole to pole at extraordinary speeds. I flagged it in my research and moved on, but then I found the Antarctic Treaty of 1959. At the height of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union agreed on almost nothing. They were competing for every inch. And yet, these two nations jointly signed an agreement restricting all military activity across Antarctica. The rational explanation says countries cooperate against shared threats, and that Antarctica simply wasn't worth fighting over. But then I found the zone restrictions. Not all of Antarctica is treated equally. Specific coordinates carry restrictions so severe they exceed any possible need for environmental protection. What is sitting at those coordinates that force the two most powerful enemies in history to shake hands and stay silent? On the surface, it is a triumph of international law, but the structural secrecy suggests a much darker necessity. Scientists working there today describe approval processes that go far beyond standard research protocols. But it is the zone restrictions that change everything. Not all of Antarctica is treated equally under the layers of policy. There are specific coordinates in the deep interior, areas nowhere near active research stations, or known biological habitats that carry restrictions so severe they exceed any need for environmental protection. These are the desensing zones, where satellite imagery from public sources conveniently degrades into low-resolution blur or is entirely redacted by corrupted data streams. We are told these zones protect fragile ice core records or microbial ecosystems. But environmental sensitivity as a justification applies most logically to coastal zones and ice shelf edges where life is documented. It applies less logically to deep, barren interior coordinates that show no ecological significance on any public document. I pulled every publicly available explanation, and the more I read, the more the justification began to bend. If these restrictions aren't for the environment, what exactly are they protecting in the deep interior where the cameras aren't allowed to see clearly? It isn't just a government or a single military body controlling this. The restriction emerges from a web of treaty obligations that produce a single outcome, a continent that remains largely unseen. When silence organizes without a central coordinator, it is far more stable than a conspiracy. But then, I looked at the raw satellite data before the corrections were applied. In the inner continent, visible in low-resolution imagery before the data cuts out, there are features geometrically inconsistent with natural ice formation, patterns that cluster at consistent intervals. Are these just tricks of the light, or are they the physical remains of the retreat, described by every ancient culture on Earth? Pareidolia is the human brain's extraordinary ability to find patterns in chaos. We see faces in clouds and order in static. Most of what the online community presents as evidence of Antarctic structures is simply this: low-resolution imagery compounded by motivated reasoning. I held that skeptical objection in front of every satellite pass I examined. But as the resolution in certain unrestricted corridor zones improved, the geometric inconsistencies became impossible to dismiss as mere natural formation. I found specific coordinates where the ridgelines do not follow the chaotic flow of the glacial drift. Instead, they form a series of 90-degree angles and parallel clusters that appear at consistent intervals. These formations aren't just strange, they are located exactly where the thermal data begins to spike. But the physical anomalies are only one thread. The one that disturbed me more is the historical one. I started pulling on a thread that led away from NASA and into the peer-reviewed anthropological archives of civilizations that had no documented contact with each other. What if the silence we see today isn't protecting the environment, but a history we aren't ready to remember? Across the globe, from the pre-Columbian Andean logs to the ancient Norse sagas, and the precise oral traditions of Polynesian navigators, there exist accounts of large beings. I'm not talking about tall men. I'm talking about figures described as 2 to 3 times the height of a normal human. They are credited with moving the stones we cannot move today. The mainstream explanation is cultural diffusion, stories traveling along trade routes. But what this theory struggles to account for is the retreat. Several of these traditions do not merely describe these beings as mythological, they describe them as having moved south. They describe a retreat to a place of ice and cold, a land at the end of the earth. The Norse speak of frost giants driven to the edges of the world. The Andean traditions describe enormous beings who descended into the earth at the southern terminus. These are treated in the source cultures as geographic records, not as fantasy. Polynesian navigators who reached Antarctica centuries before Europeans described a cold southern land inhabited by beings of immense size. Are the geometric patterns under the ice merely a trick of the light, or are they the remains of this global retreat? And if they are still there, why did a team of Russian scientists suddenly stop drilling in 2012, the moment they reached the liquid water of Lake Vostok? Suppression does not require a secret room or a handshake between villains. It only requires shared interest. In 2012, a team of Russian scientists reached the surface of Lake Vostok, a body of liquid water the size of Lake Ontario, sealed beneath 4 kilometers of ice for an estimated 15 to 34 million years. It was one of the most significant moments in the history of biology. The initial microbial samples were remarkable. They contained DNA from organisms that matched no known taxonomic family on Earth. This was briefly reported. Then the narrative underwent a sudden, aggressive closure. The official reason for the silence was contamination concerns. In subglacial drilling, introducing surface bacteria into a pristine ancient ecosystem is a genuine scientific disaster. But compare this to any other discovery. When potential biosignatures were found in a Martian meteorite, it generated decades of public debate and follow-up missions. With Vostok, the door didn't just close, it was locked. This is institutional self-preservation. If a government confirmed the biological presence of something humanoid beneath that ice, not ancient remains, but a living, breathing presence, the political and religious consequences would be completely unmanageable. No institution benefits from that kind of disruption. Whether in Washington or Moscow, the calculation is the same. Silence is safer than the truth. This self-organizing silence is far more stable than a conspiracy because it doesn't need a coordinator. It only needs every player to look at the same data and make the same quiet calculation. But while the biologists were being silenced, the satellites were picking up something the treaty couldn't hide. In 2017, NASA's GRACE satellite system, which maps gravitational variation in subsurface density, detected massive thermal anomalies beneath the very sectors we are forbidden from exploring. These are unexplained mass concentration zones, areas where something beneath the ice is significantly denser and warmer than the surrounding geology predicts. When I mapped these thermal spikes, they overlapped with the restricted coordinates and the exact retreat sites mentioned in the ancient records. I found this convergence by accident, but it's the third time independent datasets have pointed to the same frozen ground. The gravity is shifting, the heat is rising, and the treaty exceptions are the only thing keeping us from seeing what's fueling it. But why did the original drafters of the 1959 treaty include a specific, vague clause that permits military personnel to remain on site? Liquid water and geothermal heat. These are the two primary requirements for life, and we have proof both exist 4 kilometers beneath the ice. The thermal anomalies detected by NASA's GRACE satellite system were not just small deviations. They were massive unexplained mass concentration zones. When I mapped these coordinates, they sat directly on top of the sites where ancient Polynesian and Norse records claim the giants made their stand. We are told it is impossible for complex life to survive here, yet the data show something massive and warm is generating energy down there. If the environment is habitable, and the ancient maps point to these exact spots, why has every follow-up expedition been blocked by treaty exceptions? There is a physical possibility that these subglacial lakes are not just frozen tombs, but active geothermally heated habitats. The mass concentrations detected aren't just dense rock, but a level of structural organization that shouldn't exist in nature. The treaty restricts military activity, but explicitly permits military personnel to remain on site for peaceful purposes. If we are truly alone on this continent, why do we need legal loopholes that allow the world's militaries to stay stationed at these coordinates? What are they monitoring that is so sensitive? The final redaction of the records wasn't a mistake, but a calculated decision. We are tracing the outline of a door in the data. Sources from ancient myths to NASA gravity maps all point to the same few coordinates. Whatever is being protected is far beneath the surface, sealed by 4 kilometers of ice and 60 years of international law. If an advanced predecessor retreated to this continent, its discovery would not be a headline. It would be a total historical collapse. The incentive for silence isn't a conspiracy. It's the ultimate form of institutional self-preservation. The ice isn't just hiding a continent. It is hiding the truth of who really built the world before the reset began.